These are the relationships that we don't make when we're on top of the world. We forge them when we're at our bottom. And there are enough of you in here to know that when you hit your 40s, seems like everybody's hitting some kind of bottom. And then the bottom starts falling out from under the bottom, right? So I, along with several other people that have served as advisors and volunteers, committed ourselves to trying to make it easier to connect in these really, really emotional times, because we know that it's good for us and it's good for that other person. It's just good. But no matter how good, it can be hard to do. So we have empathy boot camp workshops where we talk about what to say and do to kind of navigate some of the etiquette questions around that. And there's some real learning there that we'll talk about later. We also have public art exhibits on being there that are adopted by entire neighborhoods that feature kind gestures that got people through a difficult time. And then, of course, there's the book. There's no good card for this. This is a lot of work to do to figure out if I should bring my neighbor a casserole. It's a lot of work for you to invest in talking about this issue and reading about it. We have our reasons for being here. I have two. The first is that I am not by nature good at this. I am not that natural empath that can just kind of lean into your hard times and that you feel so grateful for and you wonder, how did they know to do this? I'm not that person. I'm not a natural. I am a Sagittarius from Brooklyn. And people who know our species knows we are not the most empathic creatures on the planet. We are far more quick to tell you what we think about something than to listen to somebody else's opinion. And that, maybe we could fool ourselves into thinking that makes for really lively dinner conversation, a really engaged board meeting. Really doesn't work when connecting to somebody when they're emotionally vulnerable. Just doesn't work. Because when you don't know what to say, you do what I would do, which is to then say nothing at all. Or say something that you think you're supposed to say. And that just rarely lands right. So I wanted to get better at this. And I needed to get better at it when my friend from graduate school was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was in my mid-30s, and I guess was like developmentally at a point to look inward and reflect on how could I actually be more responsible in this situation? How can I reach out to somebody that I care about? What do I need to do? I never did reach out to my friend, but I did do what any good social scientist would do, and I researched the problem. I did. I designed an open-ended survey questionnaire that asked basically what worked and what didn't to get you through your difficult time. Supplemented that with interviews, peer-reviewed research, workshops to get better data, and that all formed the basis of the book. There's no good card for this. We all, I am sure, have had one, maybe more than one, cringe-inducing moment when you regret what you said, or when you regret not saying anything at all. People hold on to that regret for several years. And then, though, you do move on, right? I couldn't move on. Once I confronted my failure to connect with my friend from graduate school, I could not move on from being in that place. And that leads to the second deeper reason that I started this work. You see, my failure to connect to people in times of suffering was not because I was green to matters of grief. I did know grief. I did. It didn't equip me to know what to do or say, but it did teach me that it matters. And my grief story, and at this age I have a lot of them, but the one that really was the catalyst for this work was about my mom. She and I were very close. I didn't know my dad. My grandparents had passed away when I was young. I didn't have aunts or uncles. It was just me and her. It was just the two of us, and we were, like I said, very close. She also had schizophrenia. And that was a disease that she managed until she no longer could. When I was 19, she stopped taking her medication. When I was 23, her paranoia became so consuming that she changed her number, changed her locks, and put out a restraining order on me. There were some very desperate, humiliating attempts to try to connect, but I never did. And she did pass away. And that first loss, that loss of the mind, there is no ritual for mourning around that. There were no cards. There were no calls. And except for the knowledge of a few very close friends, the loss of my small but entire family went unmentioned. The aftermath of that experience, it brought up, of course, a tremendous need for belonging, right? It would come up around the time of the holidays. No guarantee that you're going to be sitting at anybody's table, right? When I had an overnight stay in the hospital, I didn't want to bother anybody about picking me up. When I was returning from Africa for 3 years in the Peace Corps, where was I going home to? Of course, I felt these needs very keenly. But what I felt even more deeply was shame. Shame for having any needs at all. And I know I'm not alone in this. In my workshops, I ask people to write down what's hard about asking for help. And invariably, the responses verbatim are like this: fear of being a burden. Fear that I will be seen for my affliction and not as me. Feeling like I should be able to tolerate the situation. And always, throughout, always, shame. This is the person. This is that person who's at the bottom of their well that we may ask casually, let me know if there's anything I can do. I can guarantee you, most of the time they won't. Maybe we give them a book. How you can manage adversity. F you. What if, instead of giving someone in pain a self-help book, we bought for ourselves a help each other book, like my book? What if we flipped the script and we prioritized the habits of mind and the aspirations that we apply to our physical health and our own mental health, applied that to our relational health? How much saner would our world be? Much saner. There are people in pain, surrounded by care, and they don't even know it. And I didn't want to be a part of that problem anymore. So that's the second deeper reason that I started this work. But even when we know that it's so important to connect in times of suffering, it can be really hard to do. Why? What gets in the way? And I name 3 roadblocks. I think these are going to feel very familiar to you. This is not rocket science. You don't want to pry, right? You don't want someone to feel like they're a source of gossip or uncomfortable with your knowledge. You don't have the bandwidth. Our own lives are crazy, right? They're falling apart. Trying to fit in somebody else's problems is really hard to do. And it can seem sometimes that when you acknowledge somebody's problem, you become responsible for it till the end of time. Right? And then, of course, we just don't want to screw it up, saying or do the wrong thing and actually make things worse. So the good news is that these fears are totally normal. But the better news is that we are making it way harder than it has to be. And I learned this from a little girl named Georgia, my daughter. She was 5 when she asked me, "Mom, what do you do for a living?" Well, I ventured a response, and I said, "Well, Georgia, I try to help friends be there for each other when they're sad." "Oh," she said, "that's easy." So I say, you should not do publicity for my book. And I asked her, though, well, what would you do to help a friend? She rattled off what I think is a pretty good list, so I'm going to share it with you. So what would Georgia do? You gave some ideas of what friends can do for each other when they're sad.
Friends can say, "I'm sorry."
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to play with me? Want to sit down with me?
Mm-hmm.
Also, do you want to take a break? Do you want to have a little hug?
Right? Fantastic. Fantastic. So we're done. Oh, God, doesn't that sound refreshingly simple? Oof, yeah. And it would work, wouldn't it? I think it would be pretty successful. But something happens between then, Georgia's age, and now. As adults, increasingly in our lives, more and more, right, as we grow, we're expected to not just be present and sweet, but competent. We're supposed to be really good at stuff. We're supposed to fix stuff. And I tell you, if my husband watched me do the dishes and said, "I'm just being present with you," I would not appreciate that. So, of course, we, thrive on being productive and problem solvers. But the space of suffering and emotional vulnerability, that's a real fragile one to bring that mindset to. That's what Georgia knows. That's what people, when they're stripped down of their expectations of how they should perform, just trust. So I want to unpack this a little bit. What is this big mystery of support? What does it actually look like? In my workshops, I collect what I call gesture cards, and it's where people write up a gesture that got them through a difficult time. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these gesture cards, as my family will attest. They're all over the house. And so I'm going to share a couple with you. This is a highly representative sample. What colleagues did that touched me. I had a miscarriage, and my colleagues sent me a beautiful bouquet of flowers with a lovely, heartfelt message attached. A friend I hadn't heard from in years emailed, called to say I'm sorry. My sister came to my house after a terrible breakup and made me something to eat. She doesn't normally come over. It meant a lot. Something a family member or friend did that was unexpected and appreciated. My son came by and did all the dishes and laundry. Take note. What my colleagues did that supported me was listen to me. What strangers did brought me and my family meals every night for over a month. And lastly, the most amazing unsuspecting gifts. A random package of diapers showed up on our porch. No name, just one large heart, and "you got this." How many of these gestures required a significant grasp of human psychology? How many of them took a lot of time? You can go there with the time and the effort. You know, you can be that person. But these people are recalling these gestures often years later. It doesn't always have to be big. It hardly ever has to be big. A couple of things came out when I looked at the data and when I also look at these gesture cards. First, that you don't really have to have an intimate knowledge of somebody to be supportive. Remember, I started this work because I was so bad at it. So I had this matrix of like levels of relationships. I even tried indexing it, like, well, it's been 10 years since I saw my friend. Oh, it was 2 years. Well, we're kind of in touch. Well, we call regularly, but we aren't physically. Like, I really was trying to map, my analytical side was just trying to map this out and identify the right gesture for the right relationship. Well, that got totally blown out of the water. There is no perfect gesture for the perfect relationship. In fact, oftentimes people appreciate those gestures from colleagues and neighbors when they have no gestures coming from friends and family. You do not need to have an intimate knowledge of a person to be there with them. Of course, there are areas of gray around using discretion, but use that as discretion and not as fear. And the second thing that I noticed, and this is really, really valuable, is that people are not recalling favors. They're not saying, you know, I asked my brother to drive me to chemo, and he did. I asked my sister to babysit, and she did. That's not what people are recalling when they're given the opportunity to say what made a difference. They're recalling things they never asked for. They're recalling the surprise. And this is why it is so important that we learn to reach out without waiting to be asked, even if we fumble in the process. But it can be so hard to do that if you don't know what to do, right? If you're the first person offering something, how do you know what to do? You want to say, just let me know if I can be of any use. I have 2 tips for that, and they revolve around this notion of trust. Trust is the bridge between your intention and your action. Trust is the bridge between your intention and your action. To help with that bridge, first area of trust is to trust what you love to do. Trust what you love to do. So I'm going to share like a small experience where I didn't learn that easily. When I eventually caught up to the fact that people cook for somebody that's kind of grieving, I mean, this took me decades to catch up to. People cook, they kind of do the meals, that thing. And so I would do that because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. And I would be fretting about it. I mean, the amount of like, red alert, I'm going shopping, I'm making this meal, clear the decks, the kitchen's mine, you know, all of this stress. And when I would prepare the dish, I was so nervous about its quality that I would hand it over with all the caveats about why it tasted so bad. Nobody wants that dish. If, however, you like to cook, and I want to know who you are, if you like to cook, then go ahead and offer up that gift without waiting to be asked. Because chances are, 20 of those lasagnas, 80% of them are from people like me. If you like to listen, trust that just by asking, how are you today, can really make a difference. If you like to garden, just offer to sweep up a lawn. Just do it. You could even do it when the person's not home if you're really afraid of these conversations. Trust what you like to do and just offer that gift. The second area of trust is to trust what you already know. It can be very intimidating to be around somebody who's gone through something difficult that you have no personal experience with. If you know somebody who's gone through a significant loss, you don't know how to support them. You've never gone through that. The reality is this: nobody has experienced the exact same thing as someone else down to the molecular level. At the same time, suffering of its many stripes actually shares some key few underlying qualities. So for example, if you have never experienced a significant personal loss, take a moment to look inside, because it's very possible you've experienced being lonely and feeling lost. Maybe you've never been fired from your job. Take a moment to look inside. You may know what it is to have your confidence broken. Trust what you know. You may not be a member of the Widows Club, but you are a member of the frail and messy human club. You are. Trust that. So in conclusion, I would say that indeed, there are so many communication tips that can help make navigating this time of grief and fear easier. But you first have to trust in your capacity to try. That means trust what you love to do and trust what you already know. Trust that even if your gesture is not wanted or needed at that time, that the meaning in your kindness, that most certainly was. Trust that. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Kelsey, show of hands, how many people in the room feel like their heart rate listening to Kelsey? Dr. Crow has returned to ideal baseline. I'm so relaxed right now. And I feel like my main takeaway from this is that I have solved the country's problems. If there were a Kelsey and a Georgia on every street in the United States, it would all be okay. I'm so grateful to be able to be a part of a conversation such as this one today. Any day, really, but especially at the end of a week like this one, where I think it's safe to say that a lot of people in the country are in some dire need of empathic action. But what do we really mean when we talk about empathy? I feel like that's become such a buzzword over the last few years, empathy, empathic. So what we're going to do right now is just delve into the nitty-gritty of effectively noticing the value of meaningful human interaction and making it happen. And as Kelsey just said, if you happen to be one of those people who feels like that would be nice, but I don't think I'm cut out for that kind of thing. The good news is that, you're wrong. You are. Everybody is. And I read this wonderful mantra that Kelsey wrote in her book, and it was just notice, fumble, and try. And who remembers stop, drop, and roll? I mean, we all do, right? I feel like if you can remember stop, drop, and roll, you can remember notice, fumble, and try. It's such an easy equation. And, I feel like that's the way to go. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the different ways in which we can feel really isolated in times of loss, or difficult times, rather, because this conversation is really for anyone going through a tough time. I was 30 and my mom was killed in a car accident. And a few years later, my father died. So there I was. Boy, did I feel lonely. I think that's the understatement of the century for me. Not only that, but I also felt like I no longer recognized myself. I felt like I was in this time in my life. I was living in New York. I was focused on building my life. I was working at a daily television show. I thought it would be nice to meet a guy, get a dog, maybe get a house one day, figure it out. And so all of my friends and coworkers were also in that state. But suddenly here I was, and I was also faced with losing everything while I was trying to build everything. I was suddenly a literal orphan, dealing with my parents' things, selling their place. No one left to worry whether I'd arrive safely back at home after traveling, as Kelsey just mentioned. And I really didn't know anybody else going through the same thing. And it was just truly terrifying and isolating. And in our book, our Modern Loss book, I think that this paragraph kind of sums up the experience, which is, it had been surprisingly difficult to find other people our age who understood what we'd been going through, or who could at least stick around to talk about our honest answers. After all, they'd asked. Even in a metropolis like New York, where you can easily get a guy in a bear suit to give you a hug on 57th Street. So, that was my very overarching experience. I felt labeled the girl with dead parents. I felt like the room got very quiet whenever I walked into it. People didn't know what to do with me. And I still wanted to feel like myself. Part of my reaction to that eventually was to help launch Modern Loss and grow this wonderful community that we have online and offline, which we do by sharing personal essays that help us control our own narrative as opposed to having someone else control it for us. And so what I'd love to know from Lucy is, what kind of isolation and identity shifts, if any, did you experience with and without Paul?
Sure. And I'm really happy to be here with you too. And when you were talking, Kelsey, I was sort of like that idea of when something terrible happens to somebody and you're kind of afraid to ask and you don't want to burst the bubble and you don't want to make them cry. And like, what should you say? Doing a book tour for your late spouse's book is like the best thing that happened to me after Paul died, because I've had so much chance to talk about him and say his name out loud and like connect with people. And even he died 2.5 years ago. And it feels really good to be talking about it. So it's made me less afraid through this whole thing. That's one thing I've learned. So I want to read a tiny section from this book, because reading from this book is maybe my favorite thing to do. So this is talking. So my husband, Paul, was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer as a neurosurgery resident at Stanford, and lived for 2 years after that, and wrote this memoir about being a physician and a patient. And he's talking at the end about how when he was getting really sick, time and his relationship to time and the future were very different from what they had been before, and really different from most people around us. And he says, verb conjugation had become muddled as well, which is correct. I am a neurosurgeon. I was a neurosurgeon. I had been a neurosurgeon before. I will be a neurosurgeon. A few months ago, I celebrated my 15th college reunion at Stanford and stood out on the quad, drinking a whiskey as a pink sun dipped below the horizon. When old friends called out parting promises, "We'll see you at the 25th," it seemed rude to respond with, "Well, probably not." And I think that, I remember making jokes about that night. But I think that sentence really sums up something for me, which is like you, Rebecca, when you're going through something hard, oftentimes you're sort of in this whole new world that you weren't in before. And, Paul was wrestling really deeply with his mortality and, what does it mean to confront my short prognosis? But the upheaval in identity was really, really striking to me, and the way in which Paul used to relate to years and years of a future and an imagined self of who he would become, and then that had completely evaporated. He wasn't going to have that time anymore. And I think the thing that was so marked about that was, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but people who were willing to be really curious about what it was actually like to be Paul at that time, and sort of get into just hearing what that felt like was really helpful, So I guess maybe that's what I'll say there. But I felt like the piece, relating to your new identity or new circumstance was almost as hard as relating to mortality. It was just like, who am I now? Or when you talked about you lose your job and you lose your confidence and you lose who you are. I think I really relate to that kind of upheaval, you know?
I think that's why, like, just that question, what's that like for you,
Sure.
is really powerful. It's so powerful.
Totally.
So what's that like for you seems like you would probably put in the box of trying to effectively connect with somebody as opposed to ineffectively do it when someone is going through a really rough time. Early this morning, I posted a query on the Modern Loss Facebook page, which is a lively group of people who are bawdy and like laughing and really like being honest about what's going on. And I hope I get to meet all of them for a drink one day. I posted a question asking people to share the most unhelpful comments they had gotten when they were in the thick of it. And I thought, well, I'll get like 25 responses and I'll just list them at this talk. Within a half hour, Facebook informed me that the post had reached 14,000 people and had generated 400 responses, ranging from, quote, "I'm glad to see you're getting over it," end quote, to someone whose husband had died 4 months prior. And this woman, by the way, was 37 years old. To, "I understand how you must feel without your mom. I lost my cat and it was so weird when she just wasn't there anymore." You know, I really don't know what to say about that. There were someone actually said this. Clearly, this type of thing is a hot button issue to me that suggests that meaningful silence can probably be a heck of a lot more effective than meaningless words. Lucy, what are some of the most unhelpful ways people have tried to connect with you? And, you know, conversely, what are some of the most helpful ones?
I think, like I say, doing a book tour was the most helpful thing for me. I think it's really hard when something hard is happening and people don't mention it. So that's the first thing. And I see like 1,000 people nodding their heads in this room. And then I'm in a Facebook group called Hot Young Widows Club. So there literally is.
You've got to say that a little
the Widows
slower
Club.
because there may be some people who want to take note of that.
Hot Young Widows Club.
You are.
Are you also envious that you're not in it? And I posted a similar thing and said, you know, we're speaking at this event and, you know, what can I post that people might find helpful? And one of the things people said is, it's so helpful when people reach out. I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's really helpful when people reach out with something specific, like not let me know what I can do, and or reach out again and again. Like I think you get, when someone's going through something hard, you sort of get intimidated. And you're like, okay, I'll invite them to do something. Do you want to come to our potluck? And then they say no, and you're like, guess they don't want to come to a potluck. And it's like, they're not the kind of person who doesn't want to come to a potluck anymore. It's like, don't be afraid to keep asking. And then I think there's something when you're asking how somebody's doing, like one of the best questions I heard recently was somebody asking not, how are you, of someone whose spouse died, but saying, how are you coping with sleeping alone? Which is a really intimate question, but like when your person dies, that's like one of the things you're thinking about the most at the beginning. And so like that real curiosity about what's this actually like for you is really, like when you can tell that somebody is genuinely curious or wants to hear the real answer, it's really comforting and cool. And it's this real opportunity to make a deeper friendship. Like that's what you said about that's when you make real friendships,
Yeah.
you know?
And I think something about that specificity, when you do have an intimate knowledge of what it is to lose somebody, you know, obviously somebody has probably felt that loss and sort of the lonely bed in some context. We can feel intimidated to offer up that kind of knowledge. Also, even to say, what was it like when she was dying?
I feel like another thing that people tend to do that can kind of go either way, and maybe this has happened to both of you, is to offer advice, to be the fixer, right? Any sentence that starts with, you know what you should do, like my red flag goes up, because normally that's the indication that they actually have absolutely no idea what I should be doing. But, you know, I want to say something that was really helpful to me when after my dad died, I'm not a particularly religious person. I'm a New York Jew. I like bagel and schmear. I'm a Jew in New York. But I don't normally go to a rabbi, for instance, for guidance, for spiritual advice as my visceral reaction when I'm going through a tough time. But it was at my father's funeral, and that was my second and last parent had died. And I was sitting in this place that I knew would have to be dismantled bit by bit, inch by inch, and I was going to be the one doing it because I'm the only child between my mom and dad. And my parents' rabbi who performed the ceremony said, I don't have a home anymore. I'm literally I'm a homeless orphan. And it sounded so dramatic when I said it out loud. And I expected him to say, well, no, it's okay. It's going to be okay. And actually he said, you're right. You don't have a home anymore. This is it. You're getting rid of this home. And what you need to do is build a new foundation somehow. Whatever that means to you, you need to do it because that's how you're going to regain your grounding as a person, physically, emotionally. Figure out what that means and go do it. And that actually was one of the most helpful things people said to me in a world where people were saying, you know what you should do. And they, it was like terrible advice. So Kelsey, why did that work? We can't all be spiritual advisors who offer up this sage wisdom all the time, but why did that work? And what have you learned in your own research about, practical advice?
Yeah, I think, I did have a line in the book, I don't remember if it stayed in there, where I said, unless they're your spiritual advisor. So, we look to spiritual advisors to take us into another perspective, to see beyond ourselves. I mean, that's why we look to these people. And so on some level, it's not surprising that he was able to offer you that perspective without diminishing your loss. And I think that's really critical. Often people will give advice as if to say, well, look, you've got to look at it like this. It's not that bad, at least. Or propose some quick fix, like you just need to go to Acapulco and you'll be fine. Just go on vacation. In fact, he was recognizing in full scope the enormity of what you were dealing with, your loss, and the literal rebuilding of your future. And in fact, it can be very hard to hear that acknowledgement in your community that I have really lost something and I've got to start over again. And someone says, yes, you do.
Yeah,
so instead, it's just these superficial, don't feel so bad about it. This little quick fix is going to make you feel better. And aren't you just pathetic that you can't see that?
Right. I think it's when you know in your gut that this is something major, and someone else can't just tell it like it is. It's not doing you any favors. You really need someone to come down to your level and sometimes actually give you a little tough love, because that's what I needed. And he was really good about it.
I'll say too, around this notion of tough love, there's tough love. Well, there's just being insensitive. When somebody's experienced a recent loss and you're just trying to say, come on, you've got to get over it. I'm really tired of hearing about this. Or if I hear one more time about chemo and how sick it's making you feel, you've got to stop. That can be really obnoxious. However, there are times when our problems consume us. That's fair. 2-3 years down the line, we're consumed by that problem. And what that person who's got some tough love has to offer, I think in the first place, is not what you should do, but to say, I don't think we have the same relationship anymore. And I want to understand that. Does that make sense? I feel that you've been consumed by this bad relationship or this hard relationship that you're in with your ex-spouse. And it feels like we can't even talk about anything else anymore. I feel like I've lost you. I heard from a woman whose mom had lost her first child, and this other woman was the second and only child. And she said, when I had done a blog post about no advice, advice is toxic material, handle with care. And she said, well, was it wrong when after 10 years of my mom ignoring me, that I yelled at her and I said, "You have to stop." I said, "No, because this is about your relationship to her as well." And that's a much more authentic place to begin, is where you're hurting and where this is hard for you when someone is going through this. It's so easy to just give advice, unless you're a spiritual guru, and a good one. And we all have those, like, informal spiritual gurus in our life too.
And what about advice or just support that comes in nonverbal format? I think you call it non-listening styles or non-listening styles or listening styles.
Right.
And that is, not you offering words, but more actually being and existing and either helping or not helping silently. What are some of those? What can you elaborate on what that is?
The non-listening styles?
Yeah.
Well, I list 5 in the book. Mm-hmm. And, I have at least 2 of them, So one of them, I'll own mine, is the doomsayer. So that person who you say, for example, "It looks like I might have MS." And I might say, "But your house isn't handicap accessible." Like, I'm already a lot further ahead of you on where this could go. And I am a pessimist by nature, right? So that's just kind of where I go. And I have learned, because of this research, I have learned to notice that impulse, shut it down, and say, "And how are you feeling about it?" Not easy for this Sagittarius from Brooklyn to do. But how are you feeling about it? Some other non-listening styles is the optimist, or as a doomsayer would say, the irrationally optimistic. That person who wouldn't acknowledge the devastating loss. Say it's even, in the grand scheme of things, a small loss, but it's not feeling small to you today. Just let that be, not small to you today. And not try to put a sunny face on it. So those are a couple of examples. I'll say one more is the epidemiologist. The person who asks a lot of questions. And this is a trap because we often feel that we're being helpful, right? Asking a lot of questions. We're curious. We want to know. I'm not shying away. Give me the nitty-gritty, right? But what can tend to happen is you wind up asking about all the things that interest you and not really being present to hear what that person wants to share. So it's a real balance between showing interest but not barraging with too many questions. And therapists, we're the worst at that. So,
does that any of that sound familiar to you, Lucy? Did you and Paul meet any epidemiologists?
I'm sure you did.
Or optimists. I'm just sure you met that guy at the reunion.
As you were saying that, I was sort of like, I think I did this to somebody yesterday.
Yeah.
And then I was like, it's like, just because you've been through something doesn't make you an expert, right? And so I think that's like an important thing to remember.
Yeah, I think that we all of us have had adversity here, probably sitting in the room, or else you wouldn't have wanted to come to a talk on this subject. And I think it's also easy for all of us to admit that we're all kind of hypocritical. We're all hypocrites. We all feel like we know what we should do and say because we've gone through something difficult, but sometimes we actually don't. We don't know what to do. We don't know what to say, and sometimes we forget. We brush someone off, and that's why this advice, the stuff that you're pointing out, it's so helpful and salient for people to remember.
It's really I was just going to say, it's just that impulse to fix. Mm-hmm. It's so strong in us, that whole notion of being competent and performing and fixing. Like, we carry that in our lives all day, every day. So it makes sense that we bring that to somebody's problems, especially when we care about them. But notice this impulse that's very natural is not going to be necessarily helpful.
So I want to move on to another theme, which is self-compassion, basically cutting ourselves a break, because sometimes the people who will put us through the ringer the most are ourselves, right? Why aren't I getting over this? Why aren't I moving through this quickly? What's wrong with me? It's been a year. They said it would take a year. It's day 366 and I'm still not there yet. What's going on? So I really feel like we actually do need to be aware that part of the issue is that we also need to help ourselves a little bit, like help ourselves out a little. So Lucy, I'm just curious as to, based on what you experienced with Paul, what do you do differently now, or at least perceive differently about reaching out to people? That both as, you know, a friend, as a parent, as a physician, what difference have you noticed since your experience with Paul's illness and death?
Yeah. I think I'm less afraid, either with my friends or colleagues, or even with my patients, actually, because I'm a physician, of asking some of these questions and then sitting there. And I think it's actually really deepened and enriched my own relationships and given me new relationships with people who are going through something that I may not have, you know, reached out to or whatever. And then there's a super specific thing that I do, which is on my calendar, I have like a monthly reminder for the date of the month when a hard thing happened to somebody I know, like someone's child died or whatever it might be, usually around someone who died. And then I like send them a text on that day. And maybe they don't care, and sometimes I don't hear back, but there were a couple people who did that to me, and I really loved it because for a while I would wake up on the 9th of the month every month and be like, it's the 9th. And there was a couple people who would check in with me, and I really noticed it. So that's one sort of really practical thing, because I think not for everybody, but for a portion of people in Hot Young Widows Club, the date matters. Like you notice those milestones, I think.
Yeah. And what about yourself? I mean, how have you treated yourself differently as a result of what you've been through? How have you managed to cut yourself a break?
I started doing mindfulness meditation actually like way before Paul got sick, when I was a resident physician and had an episode of depression. And that was like one of my biggest things that helped me with coping and helped make me less emotionally volatile, and really helped me through the pain of Paul's illness and through losing Paul, I think. So that's something I found really helpful.
So
I'm going to I'm going to interrupt because we have audience questions now, and I put them in order with, I think, of interest.
okay.
Okay?
But interestingly, I thought I would bookend the beginning of this conversation with where we're at this moment before we move to questions, which is, I'm wondering if there's a circular logic connecting the self-compassion and compassion that we start feeling for other people as a result of what we're going through to, you know, is there a connection to the isolation that we feel and this new shift in identity that we feel? Is it all just kind of like one circular experience? And I'm wondering, Kelsey, if self-compassion is a muscle that we continue to flex and continue to get stronger, build over the course of years, and it's all interconnected. Does that mean that humanity at large has a shot of becoming more empathic if we kind of go on the micro level and help ourselves and each other out?
Please say yes.
Yeah, please say yes.
Let me think about
I need
it.
some good
no,
news.
yes, ding, ding, yes. I think real compassion, where you do trust yourself and you are able to receive. So for me, self-compassion in the suffering space is being able to receive and not feel bad or unworthy or like you're an imposition, and to just gracefully receive. And I think then the self-compassion around that is, I am hurting, and thank you. And so being able to extend that touch to someone else, and giving compassion to someone else is just the real deal when you just know that you're in it together.
So we have a bunch of questions from the audience, and I'm just going to dive in here. The first one is, I recently lost my father to suicide. 3 months later, I have multiple friends and family members who have never called, emailed, texted. How do I handle these fallen relationships?
Oh la la. One of the most sort of salient quotes that I have in my book is someone who lost her mother to suicide. And she said, suicide really complicates the grieving process. Every gesture was like rain on drought-stricken land. And in my interviews, it was very common that people would turn away. In my own experience, when my mom did eventually die, they felt so guilty that they started clouding any condolences with guilt. I didn't show up because I didn't know. I wish I had known. And it really became about the illness and the problem and less about this human being that I loved. I'm sure this person asking the question loved. And so there's just that whole layer of yuck. And it sounds like whoever asked got a lot of that. And I'm very sorry. And I think it's something to sit with over time, because I think if you do read my book or you go into the workshops that we do, there is a lot of compassion that we start to feel for how hard this is. And not being a dope and tolerating bad behavior, but giving yourself a little bit of integration for how hard this might be. So not severing off any ties right away, but finding a support group of people that have been through this and really, really get it. Do some dartboards, right? Do all those email drafts, whatever you need to do. And then give yourself some time. And it's very likely that these relationships will disappear over time. The ones that you realize don't matter that much to you. And those that do, say it. Say, I felt let down. And I know this shit, is really hard to do, right? For any of us.
Here's another one. Sex ed is a thing in the US, taught to our children. Do you think death ed, how to talk and understand impermanence, should be equally taught in our schools? Catch humans early in life surrounding loss and empathy. I feel like this was
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Dr. Kalanithi.
There was this really amazing article about this written recently. Wasn't this right? It was by Jessica Zitter. Yeah, and she was talking about this from the perspective of being a physician and people understanding the medical system and what it means to live in a human mortal body. So yeah, let's do that, plus the grief part. That's gorgeous, I know. But I think I like the thing that how Georgia's actually the expert, right? How do you keep that there and then have people grow up into it? But yeah, that's a lovely question.
I know that there's a college in New Jersey, and the name is escaping me right now because I have a 6-month-old, so my brain is melted. And it's called the Death Class, and she's taught it for years. And a lot of her students are college students who have lost family members to suicide or shootings. I mean, there's it runs the gamut in there. And they start the semester feeling very, very isolated. And it's not just it's not a therapy class. She actually brings them to a morgue. She brings them to, a hospital. She speaks with palliative care physicians. They really understand. They're really exposed to every step of the not only grieving process, but the end of life process. And by extension, at the end of the semester, all of the reports across the border that they feel less isolated, they feel more secure. They feel like they can talk to other people about what they're going through. So yeah, my vote is for death ed after sex ed, or, the other way around.
Or empathy ed.
How many, do we have time for another question? Yes. Okay, great. Can you speak to the good, bad, unhelpful, upsetting, comforting interactions you had with professionals who were part of your difficult experience? Like doctors, lawyers, real estate agents. That's a really good question. Yeah. Really good question. Especially since I feel like real estate agents are like therapists.
They are.
I think mine felt like I was insane because I held on to my parents' place for an extra several months and paid the mortgage on it and whatnot. She thought I was just crazy, but it was just so hard to throw away. It was really hard. It was the most emotional, purging that I had to do in my own loss with a physical item, a home.
You want to go?
Well, let's see. I had In the medical, like the kind of one of the nicer things that have been said in the medical profession. Is that right? Like as a patient
Or it says lawyer.
or a lawyer? Or,
yeah, it's
professional.
Yeah.
anyone you would be dealing with in a difficult time who's probably got initials after their last name.
Well, yeah. I mean, one guy, you know, it was like just the circumstances surrounding my mom's death were just super, super bizarre and not anything anyone would aspire to. And there was, I got her body cremated at Cremation Consultants. I was on a budget. And it was just this like grungy storefront of a place. And he had her ashes in this box with white clouds and light blue. And he just handed it to me and he said, "I'm really sorry." And because of the circumstances surrounding her death, I just didn't hear that, you know? It was sorry for all the other stuff. And that was a beautiful encounter. And I think sometimes, too, you hear the right thing at the right time. So it's possible other people said such really beautiful things to me and it didn't land, you know? But it did them.
That's interesting. I was just running through this whole list in my head of things that I remember that people did. And one was the woman at the Social Security office who did a similar thing. Like, there's all this paperwork, but really it's like a little poem about your life, right? And it feels so loaded when you're there. And she just looked at me and said a similar thing. And I practiced medicine at Kaiser Permanente for 2 years, 5 years ago or something, and we got feedback on our patient encounters and whether people were satisfied with us as a physician. And they did some trainings where they were teaching people how to relate better to patients. And one of the things I remember is like, your score will go up 20 points if during the patient encounter you say, "And how is this affecting your day-to-day life?" And it made so much sense to me. Like, being on the other side, it was like, of course that feels so good. Like, that's and there's real medical information that you can glean from doing that too. But anyway, I think it sort of goes to show, like, those relationships, professional relationships, they're not transactional at all, right? Like, the thing you remember is the emergency room resident who had tears in his eyes, you know? Like, that's the one thing I remember from June 27th, 2013 or whatever. It's like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I sometimes feel
nice.
like for especially like for medical professionals, you know, I have that thing called like the empathy menu where you sort of select your strength. This is what I'm good at. And when you encounter doctors who are like, "I'm supposed to be really warm and gracious. Hello." And there's sort of like a stiff handshake. Like, it's just not how they are. I sometimes wish there were a way to say, "But I am one hell of a researcher, and I am going to spend that time researching your problem, because that's what I like to do." Or, "I'm somebody who can handle your scary feedback." You know, some way to sort of acknowledge, even in that setting, what strengths you bring to the patient relationship when it's a relationship like with cancer that's over some amount of time.
For me, it was not a medical professional per se. I think it was like the assistant funeral director. I don't know the official title. Like the guy next to the guy who was in charge of the funeral, my mom's funeral. The only thing that I really remember of the day of her funeral, which was just such a blur to me because she died so suddenly and violently, was they used some really gauche shade of coral lipstick on her that I had absolutely not provided to the funeral home. And they, I went in and they said, "You can say goodbye." And, I looked at her, I said, "What did you put on her? This doesn't look like her at all." I mean, it wouldn't have looked like her anyway, but it really didn't look like her. And I insisted on holding up the service for an extra 5 minutes so that I could just rummage through some things and put something on her that would make her look more like her, because I also thought she'd be pretty pissed if she knew that she was kind of like going to eternity. I think I wrote in the book looking like Tammy Faye Baker, which really is what she kind of looked like. And the director really acted.
This will not happen.
It was just not acceptable. And the director, I remember, he really acted like it was just putting him out the extra 5 minutes, I think guess he had another funeral after that. And he walked out of the room. He said, "I'll see you in a couple minutes." And the assistant guy, again, I don't remember his name, but what I remember is he came over and he said, "This looks much nicer," after I was finished. And it really helped because I felt very weird and morbid doing what I was doing. But it really did. She looked much nicer.
I'm going to ask that there was a comment, that you read the comment as because it was quite lovely to finish up. And then I have to do my gavel thing again. I'll try to be better.
So yes, there is this wonderful comment from our new best friend who should introduce themselves after. It says, "No question, just gratitude for opening yourselves up to helping others make meaning of their suffering. I think the world of all three of you."
Thank you.
Wonderful way to end, huh?
Thank you, guys.
Our thanks to the speakers today, Dr. Kelsey Crow, Dr. Lucy Kalanithi, did better that time, didn't I? Rebecca Sofer. So thank you so much for being here. And we also thank our audiences here or listening to the podcast. And a reminder that our speakers' books are for sale right out in that room, but you will have to pre-order Rebecca's. It's not for sale quite yet, but you can get the pretty postcard of the cover.
Yes.
So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Patty.